Hollow Knight used to be one of my favorite games of all time. At the same time though, it was also a game that I truly hated. If that intentionally vague sentence was a bit confusing to you, then I just want you to know that it's okay because I'm in the exact same boat. Back in 2017, when it was so popular, I just didn't really understand what the game even was or why people thought it was so good to begin with. Just from the outside looking in, the game always seemed so boring. The movement was slow, the exploration seemed one note, the combat was simple, and to top it all off, it had an art style that, for lack of a better term, didn't really excite me. I thought that it was overhyped. I thought that people were looking at a $15 price tag, figured that it was a steal, and that was it. But whether it was my crippling need to fit in with other people, the curiosity of what it was all about, or just good old plain boredom, I got the game anyways. I downloaded it, started a new save file, and oh my god. I hated it. Now, I'm not going to try and pretend like I have a perfect memory, okay? 2017 was 8 years ago, and I don't even remember what I had for breakfast this morning. But I do distinctly remember that near the end of my first playthrough, I just desperately wanted the game to be done with already. I wanted to play something else, which isn't exactly the most glowing recommendation you can give to a video game. I beat the Hollow Knight, got probably the most minimalistic ending possible, and then peaced out. Probably to play Breath of the Wild, or something like that. Now, when most people encounter a game that they don't like, they tend to just, move on with their lives. They say something like, oh, I guess it's just not for me, and then they leave. It's healthier to just move forward with the rest of your life instead of constantly fussing over every little detail about why you do or don't like a video game. Unfortunately, I am not that person. Am I missing something? Maybe I explored it in an unlucky pattern. Did I just not push the combat system? Just maybe people just like cute things. Please, the characters are like don't cute. No, don't I like Buster? Amazing boss or something. I missed the amazing lesbian sex. Oh no. This tends to happen a lot to me whenever a game comes out that everyone else loves that I don't, but Hollow Knight in particular felt even worse because, to an extent, I knew I wasn't really being fair to the game. Once again, I got the most minimalistic ending possible. Saying that I left about 30% of the entire game completely unexplored is probably an understatement if anything. And yet, at the same time, the very thought of having to go back in order to finish that last portion of it was something that I clearly didn't want to do. My brain was saying that I should go back to confirm my suspicions, and my body was telling me no. I know that sounds a bit weird, but that's really how it felt. And for the better part of about 4 years, my body was winning until YouTube randomly decided to recommend me a video about Hollow Knight. It was a video from a famous content creator / speedrunner in the community known as Fireborn talking about the player Cotton cheating at a hitless run of the Pantheon of Hallownest. And after Fireborn did his thorough analysis of the entire situation, giving some background to the cheater's history in the community, the absolute monumental feat beating P5 hitless was, and the proof to support his accusations, that's when I knew for sure. I knew I was missing something. What is that area? What are these bosses? See, body? See? We missed so much. We have to go back. Now, this is an instance where my brain was right, but for all the wrong reasons. Godhome, the area shown in the video, wasn't even released when I first played Hollow Knight. I didn't miss it because it wasn't even in the game yet. But nevertheless, my brain won, and I decided to go back to Hallownest one more time. I downloaded the game, started a new save file, beat the game to 112% this time, and oh my god. I actually liked it this time. Actually, I didn't just like it, I loved it. After I was done with that playthrough, I went back to get the 5-hour achievement, and after I was done with that playthrough, I decided to download some mods and did a couple of randomizer runs. Then, I tried doing all the Pantheons with all the bindings, and then I beat every single boss on Radiant difficulty. And then I looked up lore videos on YouTube, something that I almost never do for these types of games. I was enjoying my time with the game that much. So what happened? How can we explain this discrepancy between me from 8 years ago and me from 4 years ago? The truth is a bit messy. Over the course of those 4 years, a lot had actually changed. The game had changed, I had changed, my expectations had changed. Saying that it was just one thing or another probably wouldn't be fully accurate, especially because, like I said, I don't have a perfect memory. One thing that I can say for sure though is that 4 years ago, Hollow Knight was one of my favorite games of all time, and I was satisfied leaving it at that. As you can probably tell though from the mere existence of this video, this isn't where the story ends. Like I said, a lot can change in 4 years, and today, Hollow Knight is no longer one of my favorite games ever. Now, I played a lot of great games over those years that took its place, sure, but it's a bit more complicated than that. I think that what happened 4 years ago was the opposite of what happened 8 years ago on my first playthrough. I wasn't being fair, but this time I wasn't being fair to myself. As much as I would like to pretend it never happened, my first playthrough of the game was one that I hated. That data point is still important. I'm not saying that I wasn't a bit bullheaded back then, but ignoring how I felt 8 years ago and substituting it for something else entirely didn't feel right. I think that I ignored a lot of the flaws of the game so I could like it more. I think that if it took a whole other playthrough to impress me, then in some ways that's a flaw in and of itself. But thinking is for dreamers. If I want to actually find out if any of this is actually true, I think you know that there's only one real way I'll ever be happy. I'm going to have to go back, and I finally have to decide on how I feel about Hollow Knight. One more playthrough, one last time. Exploration is probably the most substantial element that Hollow Knight has as a game. It's not uncommon for people to mention how massive this world is, that for $15 this game's content to price ratio is off the charts, and to this I can agree with. From my very scientific analysis, Dirtmouth, the starting village you begin in, is exactly 157.5 Elder Bugs wide, and 15 1/3 Elder Bugs high. This means that the total area shown here is a staggering 2,409.75 Elder Bugs squared. If you extrapolated this information across the entirety of Hollow Nest, then use some very simple geometry in order to cut out all the negative areas, then we come to the conclusion that in total, Hollow Nest is precisely, you can read it, 62,412.525 Elder Bugs squared. Divide that by the price and you get 4,160.835 Elder Bugs per dollar, which is massive. As you can probably tell from how this section has started, I don't really care about how big Hollow Knight actually is. A game can have so much content that it needs to be measured by the metric tons, but if most of it is poorly made, then as far as I'm concerned, it's all just fat. I would legitimately prefer an amazing game that's only 10 hours long over a whatever game that's over 60. Games aren't just time machines for me, there is something to engage with. Thankfully, Hollow Knight isn't all just bloat. I can safely say that exploration is extremely well crafted in this game, with only one glaring exception: the beginning. Hollow Knight's first two opening areas, the Forgotten Crossroads and Green Path, are easily the worst parts of the entire game in terms of exploration for a variety of different reasons. First off, this is where the amount of freedom you have to explore the game is at its absolute lowest. You have to go through King's Pass, and then you have to go through the Forgotten Crossroads, and then you have to go through Green Path. There aren't any real decisions that need to be made here in terms of exploration. On its own, this wouldn't be a problem if not for the fact that the levels themselves are chock full of dead ends that need abilities in order to get by them. In total, I counted 10 different dead ends that work like this in the Forgotten Crossroads alone, and 7 in Green Path. 10 and 7. Limiting the player's options both in terms of how they can explore the world and the actual levels themselves can discourage them from exploring altogether. Why wander around if I'm just going to hit a dead end? Why wander at all when the game is just going to railroad me into the one area it actually wants me to go? If you're thinking to yourself, wow, this sounds like every single Metroidvania that I've ever played before, then good. Because you're right. And I'm glad that you're actually thinking. Every argument I've given up to this point in the video is bad and should be discarded immediately. Linearity isn't explicitly a bad thing, and the statistic of 10 and 7 dead ends is meaningless because you're not really comparing it to anything. It's about as meaningful as the Elder Bug number I gave in the beginning of this section. When used like this, those numbers are essentially worthless. Don't get me wrong though, there is a massive problem here with Hollow Knight's beginning areas, and while these 2 points I just brought up aren't it, they are still tangentially related to it in some way. By bringing them up like this, I hope to isolate what I believe to be the real problem here more effectively. But enough beating around the bush. If you watched my previous videos, you probably know what's coming up next. I'm going to be comparing Hollow Knight to some other amazing Metroidvanias. The way that I know that neither the linearity or the locked pathways are the issue here is because by comparison, these traits are perfectly normal. The equivalent areas in Blasphemous 2, Metroid Dread, and Metroid Prime 1 all start off excessively linear as well, and have just as many locked pathways, if not more. Here are those numbers on screen right now so you have a solid idea of what I mean. Even if you took a point or two off because you disagree with my definition of a dead end, none of them would be any worse than Green Path, and while the Crossroads may be on the higher end, it still wouldn't be lower than Metroid Dread. Yet the openings to all of these games are much better than Hollow Knight. So what's going on here? Why don't I like the opening to Hollow Knight as much? What's the difference? The most straightforward answer comes when we look at Blasphemous 2 and Metroid Dread in particular. Compared to those two games, Hollow Knight has some really bad backtracking. While players might not mind encountering a locked door every now and again, what they do mind is when you make them slowly walk across a giant empty room, have them hit a dead end, and then make them slowly walk back across all over again. They mind when you have them dive into 2 long hallways of killer exploding jellyfishes, have them hit a dead end, and then make them climb all the way back up. They mind when you make them go to the right side of a zone, hit them with 3 dead ends, and then make them go all the way back to the left side of the zone just to get back on track. As you can tell from my very specific examples, this is the kind of thing you can expect from Hollow Knight's opening hours if you were unfortunate enough to be born with any sort of curiosity or wonder in your heart. I'm aware that the game isn't making you do anything, and this problem does go away if you just don't explore, but that's kind of my point. By having this insistent backtracking, the game is actively discouraging exploration. It's punishing you for wanting to wander off, which for a game all about exploring is something that should almost never happen. Fixing this problem has 2 different solutions, both of which are coincidentally provided by the 2 games we just looked at. The first solution is to make the Knight's starting moveset much faster or more interesting. From the beginning of Metroid Dread, Samus has a wall jump, a slide, and ledge grabbing, which makes platforming a bit more interesting, but the real sinker here is her default run speed. I don't have any way to record footage from my Switch, but the speed at which Samus runs across rooms at full speed is clearly much faster. A sprint or a run button would have been something that Hollow Knight could have benefited from even after the opening. But barring that, you could always have the Knight start off with the dash or hell maybe even the wall jump. Both of these things would reduce the time it takes to backtrack and makes navigating these two areas more interesting. The second solution is to simply reduce the space between the dead ends and the right way through the level. This is the solution that Blasphemous 2 uses, and thankfully I can actually show you footage of it this time to support my argument. Right here, there's this small outcrop that requires a double jump, but it's also located right next to the tiny elevator you have to use to go up. This glass walkway literally drops you to the correct path. These mirrors that need the daggers are on the side of the corridor you have to climb up, and I can go on and on. The only exception to this rule is this room right here that requires 2 weapons to unlock, and even then, it's only a small drop away from getting back on track. By having dead ends be placed like this, you don't force the player to constantly shuffle back and forward pointlessly between 2 rooms. The game isn't punishing you for exploring like Hollow Knight is. I think that Hollow Knight could implement either of these 2 solutions and be fine, but just in case it can't or it doesn't want to, there is another weirder way to solve this problem. Key jingling. Metroid Prime actually does have a fair amount of backtracking too. Maybe it isn't as bad as Hollow Knight's, but it's pretty clear that it's here. Curiously enough though, it doesn't resort to making movement faster or reducing space to solve backtracking like the other 2 games did. Instead, it goes for a much more unorthodox method of just throwing power-ups at the players over and over and over again in an attempt to placate them. In just the first 40 minutes of playing Metroid Prime, I got the Charged Beam, the missiles, the Morph Ball, and the bombs for a total of 1 power-up every 10 minutes, and this was with exploring the level very thoroughly. Jumping over to the exact same 40-minute mark in Hollow Knight, and you only have 1 power-up at this point, and after that, it takes a whole 50 minutes to get the next one in the dash. Even if you cut that time in half on account of me being a dumbass, that's still a power-up every 25 minutes or so. The difference in how this game distributes power-ups early on is pretty clear here. Metroid Prime's solution is kind of like giving your child an iPad. You're not really solving the problem here, but this solution distracts players for long enough to at least keep them happy. This isn't the last time we'll be talking about backtracking in this video. To an extent, it's something that looms over the entire game, but it's especially important in the beginning because that's the player at their slowest and it's also their first impression. Them coming to the conclusion that this is a linear game that uses backtracking to pad out playtime is the last thing that the game should want, especially considering that this isn't anywhere close to being true. Hollow Knight is one of the most open-ended Metroidvanias I've ever played before, but for some reason it waits until about 2 hours into the game to really show its hand. Those of you who are more familiar with the game probably know what I'm talking about. It's this moment right here when you obtain the wall jump ability in the Mantis Village. While I have some minor nitpicks about how the game should have better conveyed how big of a moment this was, this is probably where exploration in Hollow Knight goes from a 4 out of 10 to a 9 out of 10. From this point, about 80% of the entirety of Hollownest becomes available to you to explore however you may please. There's the intended route of going through the City of Tears into the Soul Sanctuary to get Desolate Dive. Or maybe you're curious to where this manhole cover leads and you decide to use a simple key in order to explore it. Maybe you remember that one dead end back in Green Path that requires the wall jump, at which point you'll find Howling Cliffs. Continue into the Mantis Village and fight the Mantis Lords, only to end up in the Jaws of Deepness. Pop around through the Kingdom's Edge and participate in the Colosseum. Go back to get the lantern and head to Crystal Peaks for the Super Dash. Stumble your way into the burial grounds for the Dream Nail. The amount of freedom and independence you have to just explore wherever you want to at this point cannot be understated. It's actually kind of amazing. Though since I said earlier in this video that linearity isn't inherently a bad thing, I guess I also have to argue here why this amount of freedom and open-endedness is actually a really good thing. Firstly, as evident by my little splurge from earlier, most places you can explore from this point in the game have a substantial reason to do so. Crystal Peaks has the Crystal Heart, the City of Tears has Desolate Dive and the Nailsmith, Kingdom's Edge has the Colosseum, Deepness has the Tram Pass, the Ancient Basin has a Palor and a very helpful stag station, the Howling Cliffs has a Nail Art, and the Ancient Burial Ground has the Dream Nail. The three odd ones out here are the Royal Waterways, the Hive, and Fog Canyon. These areas are either an upgrade away from being worthwhile, or in the Hive's case, never worthwhile to explore ever. Still though, the exceptions are just that. They're exceptions, even without taking into account all the mass upgrades, soul upgrades, or charms that you can obtain from these areas. The game's intent is pretty clear. Players will feel rewarded almost anywhere they go, while also having the ability to make their own decisions. There's no better combination for exploration than those two things. It also significantly improves replayability, as it allows one playthrough to be drastically different from another. In terms of criticism, there's only one real complaint I have with this sort of structure, and it's that it can be legitimately confusing figuring out where you have to go. I know that to an extent, that's the deal you make when you give the players so much freedom to explore, but this sort of thing can lead to being annoying when you push it too far. As someone who binges games in a week or so, it's not really a problem for me, but imagine someone who plays the game for a bit, puts it down for about a week or two, and then comes back to this giant sprawling map that they don't even remember. At the very least, there should be an option to point players in the correct direction if they want the help, and no, Elderbug or the Dreamer waypoints on the map don't count. The latter neglects to tell you about the Monarch Wings, Isma's Tear, and the Crystal Heart, which are required to beat the game, and the former is just vague, finger-pointing nonsense. Aside from this, the backtracking comes back with a small vengeance to hurt the exploration once again. While your moveset expands to reduce the tedium of backtracking, there are still a few choice locations in Hollow Knight that take a bit too long to get to. Overall, this is more of a nitpick than anything, but once again, a sprint button would have really helped here. You're going to be spamming the right trigger on your controller a lot, which can be really straining if you play for long enough. The last point I want to bring up in terms of exploration is the actual areas themselves. It might surprise some of you when I say that if you just want to get to a boss or an ability, then the actual zones in Hollow Knight are actually quite linear. Unlike something like Lies of P though, this is more than fine because of the meaningful connections to the rest of the world. Sure, if you want to get to Soul Master in the City of Tears, there's really only one way to do that, but who's to say that you're in the City of Tears for Soul Master to begin with? My problem with linear exploration is usually that there aren't any meaningful decisions to be made by the player, but in this instance, choosing to go after Soul Master is the decision. There are a multitude of other things you could be choosing to do besides that. It would have been nice to have multiple pathways for the areas in Isolation 2, but you won't be short of decisions to make throughout the game, so you don't really need it. All you need is a healthy amount of collectibles to string the player along, a good spread of enemy variety for the entire level, and enough upgrades to aid in the player's sense of progression. If it wasn't obvious by now, these are things that I think that Hollow Knight tends to handle pretty well, but it goes above and beyond by doing one subtle thing that a lot of games tend to neglect. It strives to make every area memorable in some way. You'd think with how vague and nebulous the concept of memorability is, that it and I would be mortal enemies, but honestly that couldn't be farther from the truth. Memories make you who you are, the good ones, the bad ones, every fiber of your being stems from the things that you can remember. In that sense, how well a game can leave an impression on you is the most important part of it. It can accomplish this by being, well, impressive, but it can also do the same thing by being distinct and unique. While I don't think that any of the areas are incredibly impressive on their own, it's clear that Team Cherry did their best to give each area its own distinct feeling. Green Path is littered with traps and ambushes to simulate the unforgiving nature of a rainforest. The endless conveyor belts of the Crystal Peaks not only convey the mechanical nature of these mines, but also gives the player a distinct way of traversing not seen anywhere else. The Blue Lake has almost no combat, just the deep aqua hue of its waters, tranquil, calm, and perfect for scuba diving. The Mantis village is littered with locked doors, the City of Tears uses constant elevators to convey the verticality of its buildings, the gigantic area of the abyss remains strangely barren, and of course there's Deep Nest. Originally, Deep Nest was going to have its own mini section in this video. In it, I was going to try and argue whether or not the memorability it provided was enough to offset how insanely unfun it was as a level. Ultimately, I decided against it because memorability is already difficult to quantify, and I couldn't think of any examples to compare it to other than maybe Blighttown from Dark Souls 1. Long story short, I think that Deep Nest goes too far. While the experience it offers is certainly a unique one, I think that developers should find better ways to make their levels more memorable without resorting to making them confusing and unfun on purpose. Having said that though, when I compared it to other more generic levels like Howling Cliffs and the appropriately named Forgotten Crossroads, I didn't want Deep Nest to be more like them at all. They're technically better designed, but they lose something by not having anything that stands out. I think that speaks to how important memorability is, that a level that is intentionally trying to be awful can still not be the worst one in the game because of how much it stands out. Hollow Knight does a great job at that, and while not every area is a hitter, I'm glad that this is an aspect of exploration that Team Cherry didn't forget. The best way that I can describe Hollow Knight's story is that it's a bit like ambient music. If you were expecting any sort of rhythm or traditional structure to it, then I hate to tell you this, but you're setting yourself up for disappointment. While there is some guidance and communication similar to something you'd find in a more traditional story, by all means Hollow Knight is more than happy to let the bulk of it just blend into the rest of the world. Like the music and the background art, there is a reason it is the way that it is, but it doesn't mind if you don't notice. To an extent, fading into the backdrop is kind of the point. In any other form of media, I think that this method of storytelling on its own wouldn't be enough, but in a video game, there is one key advantage that is really obvious here. It allows the player to just focus on the gameplay. I know that might sound like a backhanded compliment, that the advantage of ambient storytelling is that you could just choose to avoid it, but I really do mean it that this sort of method is probably for the best given how Hollow Knight is structured. People who don't care about the story don't get bogged down by dialogue boxes and cutscenes, and people who do can talk to every single NPC to figure out why Dung Defender made statues of his friends out of shit. Don't get me wrong though, that doesn't mean that I think the actual story itself is any good. The plot that unfolds while you are actually playing the game is just the knight wandering about while Hornet and the Dreamers just pull them along, and even the admittedly more comprehensive lore still leaves a lot of unanswered questions and speculations that aren't exactly rock solid. For example, why does the knight even come back to Hollow Nest in the first place? In the game, it's heavily implied that it was the Radiance that called on them, but that answer doesn't really make any sense. The Radiance was already leaking by the time the knight arrived. There wasn't any real reason to call on the knight to free her when she could have just waited a bit instead. Even if we ignore that, how did she even know that we would attempt to free her in the first place? The Radiance obviously has no control over our character. Was she trying to be a super smart anime villain that just knew that we would break the seal even though we didn't have a reason to? I guess she was just shooting in the dark, but that still doesn't make sense either. Remember that we're a vessel, the only thing that could possibly contain the Radiance's powers, even if it's just for a little bit. She's literally sitting in one right now. Why does she not take this possibility into account when she calls on us? The best outcome for this theory is that the Radiance called on us by accident. that this signal isn't fully in her control, and if she had a choice, that she would have never called a vessel to begin with. This is something that is never explicitly stated by the game or even hinted to, but if we want this idea to work, then that's the assumption we have to make up. The game also floats the idea that it was the Hollow Knight that called us, but my problem with that one is much more simple. How? The Radians probably could communicate to us via dreams because she's the god of dreams, but the Hollow Knight has no such power. The best interpretation is that the void that makes up our character and the Hollow Knight are connected in some way that allows for long-range communication, but again, that's never hinted to either. While we're just making stuff up, why not bring in a third theory? Maybe the Knight didn't get called at all. Maybe the Knight has amnesia and is subconsciously returning to their old home for some answers. Maybe the Knight does remember their past and wants some sort of revenge on the Pale King. Maybe they just really needed to go to the bathroom. Does the game ever give a proper explanation or definitive answer to any of these questions? The answer is obviously no. There's this one line here, and that's it. As far as I'm concerned, my bathroom theory is just as valid because even the dreamers themselves are kind of just guessing here. I know to some of you this may seem really nitpicky, but this isn't like me asking why Zote and the Knight wear the same clothes or something minor like that. Why our main character chooses to return home in the first place is something that's really important to the story and should have a good reason behind it. The fact that I have to do mental gymnastics and cover for the game at every turn in order to even conceive a possible answer is a problem. Do enough mental gymnastics and even somehow Palpatine returned can start making sense. This isn't an isolated incident either. Other important questions get a similar treatment as well, oftentimes with just as much making stuff up, if not more. For example, how did the vessels escape the abyss? There's only one way out of here and it was locked shut by a key that only the Pale King had. It was even locked by the time we came back to Hallownest in the game. We know there must have been another way out of here, so where is it? The community's actual response to this question is that there must have been a crack somewhere, we just can't see it. Why and how did Hornet become a dreamer in the Seal siblings ending? Wasn't it the Pale King that made that seal? Does the temple just require someone to be unconscious somewhere near it in order to work? Maybe because Hornet and the Knight are half Pale King, one of them mated by accident? I couldn't even find a guess for this one. Hornet just becomes a dreamer for reasons, and that's it. This is why I hate lore diving in these types of games. It's already disappointing enough when a regular story has no explanation for clearly important events, but it's on another level entirely when you spend hours and hours on the internet combing through YouTube videos and documentation only to find jack shit. If you're one of those people who do like to lore dive, then I want you to know that I understand that on its own, this sort of detective work can be really fun. Putting pieces together and creating theories based on evidence you find in the game is undoubtedly satisfying, and if that's what Team Cherry were aiming for, then by all means they succeeded. That doesn't mean that the story itself is any good. Like a giant jigsaw puzzle, the fun in ambient storytelling is figuring out how all of these pieces work together, not the finished picture that you get after it's all said and done. Since I want to leave this section off on a positive note, I want to discuss an aspect of Hollow Knight's story that I actually do enjoy: the characters. While they aren't the most complex or multifaceted individuals ever, the game does one really important thing here that makes me like them way more. It treats them like real people. This might sound silly coming from the game where everyone is a talking cartoon bug, but I really do mean it here. The characters don't revolve around the player. They have their own goals and even make their own way throughout the world, sometimes without the player even noticing. Unlike some other games where every single NPC is cardboard sexual, most of the characters in Hollow Knight don't really care about you. There are the polite ones like Quirrell and Cloth, but a lot of Hollow Knight's residents are actually outright pricks. Even Elderbug can get a bit saucy if you refuse to give him the delicate flower. I think that that's actually a really good thing. It makes them feel more down to earth, like they were their own person before they met you, and they'll be their own person after you're gone. It might sound minor, but you would be surprised with how many games tend to get this part wrong. The only thing I would have loved to see is more interactions between the characters themselves. Characters bouncing off of one another and interacting with each other is a big part of character writing, and it's a shame that the amount of times I can even remember two or more of them doing anything with each other can be counted on one hand. Imagine Tiso arrogantly challenging Hornet or Quirrell and then getting his ass handed to him. Imagine Sly and Islada comparing their shops together and treating each other like competition. Stuff like that. This is the big thing missing here, but overall, Team Cherry did a great job with making these characters feel diverse and authentic. They really went above and beyond. Regardless of how much my opinion on Hollow Knight has changed over the years, there's always been one thing that has remained consistent throughout all of my previous playthroughs. I think that combat is the worst part about Hollow Knight. To an extent, I still feel that way, but it's only on this most recent playthrough that I realize what the real issue is here. Hollow Knight's combat is the very definition of simple to learn, but difficult to master. While there are a wide variety of moves at your disposal here, there are only really 4 buttons you need to worry about. The jump, the nail, the soul, and the dash button. The way that the game expands your moveset is by adding modifiers to each of these 4 things, such as a directional input or holding the button down. It reminds me a lot of Super Smash Bros., where even though every character has over 18 different moves, it's very easy to remember all of them because on the actual controller, it's really only 5 buttons plus pushing the stick in a certain way, which is way more intuitive. The depth doesn't come from timing or execution. The depth comes from situational awareness and spacing, which is something that I can really appreciate. That's not to say that I don't enjoy games with tight timing windows and high execution, but honestly, in this day and age where every game seems to want to include some sort of parry mechanic, I'm glad that Hollow Knight is something distinctly different. As you can probably tell by now, my problem with the combat isn't with the actual combat system itself. It has something to do with something that surrounds it. The bosses. You can have the greatest movement system or combat mechanics ever seen in a game, but if none of the content ever pushes it to its full potential, then it's all effectively wasted. That responsibility usually falls on the bosses, but most of the bosses in this game do a really poor job of testing the player's mastery over their entire moveset. Here's a list of every single boss in the entire game. Now, what I'm going to do is put some icons next to each of their names. Each of these icons represent the abilities that you need in order to beat them without ever taking damage. If you see this one, you need the dash. If you see this one, you need the wall jump, etc, etc. If a boss has an attack that can be avoided with multiple different abilities, I'll only count the one that you get the soonest. For example, if you need to use the dash or the double jump to avoid an attack, I'll only place a dash icon next to that boss. Also, while a fight might not explicitly require an ability every time you fight the boss, if there is some unlucky set of circumstances that makes it necessary sometimes, then I will still count that as the boss needing it. For example, Elder Hu can be beaten without the dash most of the time, but since there is this unlucky pattern of rings that you can't walk away from, I think that this still counts as him requiring the dash. If there is any sort of ambiguity here with the unlucky situations, I will always favor the game and give the boss an icon anyways. Finally, I will assume that you don't have any charms equipped. This is to the game's favor, so for the sake of my argument against it, there shouldn't really be any problem here. Now that we have all of our ducks in a row, let's start labeling. Firstly, we have the dash. This is the ability that is the most required to avoid damage, which makes a lot of sense since it's also one of the earliest ones you can get. In total, there are 20 different bosses that require the dash as shown here. Next, let's move on to the wall jump, which you would think would get a similar treatment as the dash considering how early you get it, but that's not really true. Only 3 bosses actually take advantage of it. This move here from White Defender, along with certain unlucky circumstances with Umu and Absolute Radiance. For Vengeful Spirit, the very first upgrade you get in the game, there are 5 bosses: Flukeworm, the Collector, Broken Vessel, Lost Kin, and Grey Prince Zote. The big asterisk here is that you only need Vengeful Spirit if you don't have enough nail upgrades in order to kill the minions quickly. If you don't buy space with a spell, you're going to be swarmed, at which point damage becomes practically unavoidable. Next, we have the double jump. The only 4 bosses in the entire game that forces you to use the double jump are Grey Prince Zote, Pure Vessel, the Radiance, and Absolute Radiance. For Shade Cloak, you have 4 in Traitor Lord, Pure Vessel, Radiance, and Absolute Radiance. Finally, we have the Nothing icon. These bosses don't require any ability in order to beat them perfectly, no matter what. As a sign of good faith, I'm going to not apply this icon to any of the bosses that you can fight before getting the dash. They don't even have the opportunity to test your upgrades, so it's not really fair to include them here. After all that, we have 15 different bosses that don't force you to use anything aside from the starting moveset. The problem here is clear. Having this expansive of a moveset while also only having 3, arguably 4 bosses in the game that do anything significant with it is like having a Nobel Prize winner teach high school chemistry. It's just a giant waste. At first, I was willing to chalk this up to another trade-off of having the world be so open-ended, that the developers had to design bosses around the bare minimum because they couldn't be sure if a player had or didn't have an ability, but another look at the list proves that this isn't completely true. Moss Charger, for example, has the very entrance to their arena blocked off behind the dash ability, and yet Moss Charger themselves never really requires it for the entire fight. A similar story goes for the second Hornet fight. To get here, you need the double jump ability, which also suggests you have the crystal dash, the wall jump, and the dash, but she only forces you to use one of them. Watcher Knight never needs a double jump even though you need it to get to them, the Mantis Lords never need the wall jump, the penultimate boss of the entire base game only needs the dash, and I can keep going on and on. While there are some bosses that are obviously restricted because of where they're placed in the game, I think that for most bosses this isn't really the problem. Even when given the opportunity to, the bosses just don't want to push the knight's moveset to its full potential. Don't get me wrong, I know you can still try and squeeze out the rest of your moveset to be more aggressive, but this is more of a consolation prize rather than a flat out replacement. I know I've been quite harsh on the bosses up until this point, but I want you to understand that this problem that I have with how they neglect to push the combat system is not the same thing as me outright hating them. There's obviously a lot more that goes into a boss fight other than this one single thing. For example, the visuals and designs are all top notch. If you were a bit put off when I said that I wasn't really a fan of the game's visuals in the opening to this video, then you'll be glad to hear that this is something that I've definitely changed my mind about over the past couple of years. There are a few generic looking bosses, sure, but in general the boss designs in this game do an amazing job at conveying their personalities and even a bit about the fights themselves. There wasn't really any attack in the game that made me go, wow, that kind of came out of nowhere, if that makes sense. The visual designs and the boss designs match really well, which is a much harder thing to accomplish than most people may realize. Another thing the bosses do really well is provide an appropriate amount of challenge without going overboard or feeling unfair. Admittedly, this is a difficult thing for me to judge properly as someone who has played the game over 5 times now, but even when playing on Radiant difficulty in the boss hall, I never felt like any of them depended on luck in order to get by. The closest you get to something like that is probably Markarth or Absolute Radiance, and even then I can't be completely sure if this is a skill issue or not. The fact that I even have to stretch this far in order to find something even resembling unfairness should convey how fair I think all of the bosses are in this game. It's not easy to find that balance of challenging but fair, and Hollow Knight somehow passes with flying colors. These bosses are good, they have their upsides for sure, but when we look back at that list again, and then we look at some of my favorite fights in the entire game, I can't help but feel like there could have been something more here. The bosses do their job okay for a fresh playthrough, but in terms of combat and enjoyment, I wouldn't really want to fight most of them any more than once or twice. Godhome is a boss rush mode in Hollow Knight in which you fight every boss in the game again about once or twice. If you're thinking that I would hate Godhome based on everything I just said, then you would be mostly correct. I do, in fact, hate 90% of Godhome. If you gave me the option to just flat out erase the first 3 Pantheons, I would do so without any questions. Maybe even the 4th one depending on what kind of mood I'm in that day. But that last 10%, it might not sound like a lot, but it is. It's tremendous. In fact, I would go as far as to say that that last 10% of Godhome is flat out my favorite part about Hollow Knight. Firstly, while the Pantheons are mostly just rematches with all of the old bosses, there are a bunch of new ones introduced in them to keep you moving along to see all of the new content. 2 of these bosses also happen to be my favorite bosses in the entire game. Fighting them was probably the point in which I realized just how much potential this game's combat system had to begin with, and I really wish there were more like them. Secondly, there are several different modifiers that can be applied to the bosses in order to make them more challenging and tense. I'm a bit hesitant to even write this out because I was this close to finishing a video without talking about difficulty, but I think I just have to accept it and state that I really like it when a game is hard. Path of Pain, a platforming challenge I haven't even mentioned yet, is also one of my favorite parts of Hollow Knight. And as strange as it might sound, I really enjoy the Colosseum of Fools without the double jump. I don't know why I am the way that I am, but that's not the point. The point is that Godhome gives me all the challenge I could ever need. There's a difficulty mode that one-shots you, there are bindings that have a few different effects like reducing your damage or the amount of soul you can hold, and of course there's the Pantheon of Hallownest. P5, as is more commonly known, is a boss rush against almost every single boss in the entire game, and is probably the thing about Hollow Knight that I have the most conflicting feelings about. On one hand, a vast majority of this boss rush is just a waste of time. It's crazy that even at the final challenge, the very precipice of the gods, the trial reserved for only the best, that somehow the game can find the galls to ask me to fight Moss Charger for a 3rd time. A majority of these bosses are just cannon fodder. There are cutscenes where I have to mash the attack button in order to skip. At the same time though, the tension you feel at the end of P5 is undeniable. Getting to Absolute Radiance knowing that a couple of slip-ups can send you all the way back is something that is wonderfully terrifying. It's a feeling that almost no other game has given me, but I'm realizing now that that feeling can only exist because of those annoyances. The only reason the end has any stakes at all is because of the boring bosses at the beginning. Which raises the question, does that intense feeling at the end justify all the slog you need for it to work? And is P5 just fine the way it is? This actually isn't the first time we've had to answer this type of question in this video. It actually isn't even the 2nd or the 3rd time either. In a funny way, that's kind of Hollow Knight's shining motto. It always takes things too far. The world is huge and too confusing, but that's because it wants to offer a true sense of adventure. The areas are bloodthirsty and sometimes empty, but that's because it wants to make them all unique. Its lore is obtuse and vague, but that's because it wants the player to have fun putting it all together on their own. I think that more than anything, this is why my feelings on Hollow Knight have always bounced back and forward between good and bad, because most of the things I hate about the game also have something that I really love attached to the hip. Hollow Knight's core issue isn't caused by outright bad game design, it's caused by a lack of restraint. In a way, I kind of love that, but just like the Pantheon of Hollowness, there was some room for Team Cherry to pull back here while also keeping that mad formula that they adore so much. Hopefully they can find that perfect balance in their next game, but for now I still have to decide whether or not I like the Pantheon of Hollownest. And after all that, yeah, I think I do. I don't have any numbers, no reason, no examples, no comparisons. I just like it. Hey, thanks for watching the video till the end. Fuck, I messed up already. Hey, thanks for watching till the end of the video. I put a lot of... how the fuck? Look, okay? People are gonna come home in like 5 minutes and I don't want them to think I'm a fucking crazy person talking to my computer all day, talking to no one. Okay, so let's make this quick. So, Lies of P Overture. That video, really well. 500 views. I know that sounds like, small numbers to, the more general audience, but it's such a big deal for me, so honestly... thanks. I really appreciate that. Okay. So, yeah, so this video, it was supposed to come out like earlier, but I rewrote the script like 3 different times. People are gonna... I think that's the doorbell. Okay, no, hold on. I mean, Silk Song is coming out in like a week. Yeah, Doom the Dark Ages is happening never. Shit.